Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Kate Moody. Today we're talking about trade and the tensions that have swept the globe following Donald Trump's moves to impose tariffs on certain goods imported to the United States. I'm joined by Arancha Gonzales, Executive Director of the International Trade Centre, the joint agency of the UN Conference on Trade and Development and the World Trade Organization based in Geneva. Arancha, thank you so much for being with us today. Why do you think we're seeing such heated rhetoric and indeed actions on trade at the moment? Is it as simple as saying it's all Donald Trump's fault, or is there something else going on here?
No, I think we have underlying problems. Take steel and aluminum. There is a problem with overcapacity in steel and aluminum. There is more capacity today than the market is capable of absorbing. Take intellectual property rights in China. There are issues to be addressed. The big question is, how do we get this done? How do we address this? And my sense is that we have created, since the Second World War, a system to deal with this kind of issues, that there is an international system with rules and procedures that are not there because countries want to be nice to each other, but because they understand that the best guarantee, the best insurance policy collectively to address issues that have a collective impact is with rules and procedures. Rules-based and not deals-based, as seems to be what we're seeing now.
So we are seeing this sort of tit-for-tat retaliation emerging. You tax us, we'll tax you. What, in your opinion, is another really viable way for countries to respond to these sorts of moves?
Well, I think this is not a viable way for a very simple reason. Economies of countries are so interlinked that if you do it to me, I will do it to you. And then the two of us will be worse off than when we started this conversation. So there is another way of doing this. Obviously, you will use your leverage and you will use your pressure. But in my view, there are fora, there are procedures, there are organizations where countries can sit down. Take the G20. Just finished its meeting, finance and central bankers meeting in Argentina. That is a very good place to start this kind of conversation and to start putting together the elements of a recalibrated, a redone set of rules on overcapacity of steel or the many other issues that we may have to change.
So why aren't people seizing those sorts of opportunities to really tackle these issues?
Well, some would tell you that the system doesn't work, that it's broken, that it's not leading to change. Others will tell you that we are not trying hard enough. That, of course, if you engage in a conversation, you're going to have to be ready to give a little bit as you take a little bit, that you have to learn to rebuild consensus. And of course, building consensus is not easy. We know that. But in my view, it's the most responsible way of dealing with the interconnection of our economies, our job markets, our societies. Not doing it would mean rupture. And rupture, as we have seen in these last days, means stock exchange telling us, be careful. This is a risk that will have global consequences on the economy. That is not a very responsible way of dealing with these matters.
Now, the expression trade war has been back in the headlines recently. I know it's not a term that you like to use very much, but it is now something that's emerged as a real possibility. We've heard President Trump say that he thinks that trade wars can be easy to win and good for Americans. What's your reaction?
I don't think trade wars are good for anybody. I think, as a matter of fact, that trade wars will leave everybody worse off. And again, it's a very simple thing. Today, many of the products that America trades are not purely made wholly in America. They are made with components from other parts of the world. They are bringing the innovation, the ingenuity, the labor of Americans, but also of other countries around the world. Take cars in America. They are partly produced in Canada and Mexico, in the US. And that is good because if Canada and Mexico are stable and they are growing, they are good for the United States. Given this interconnection, if you do it to me, I do it to you. And then the two of us will be losing. This is why I don't like the word trade wars. And I do not think that they are going to be won by anybody. Everybody would be worse off. Think of all the companies in the US that are today extremely nervous because other countries will just pick on them to put pressure on the US administration. they are very uncomfortable, thinking, well, we have no stake in this fight, and yet we're going to be affected. Millions of jobs in people producing cars, in people producing clothes, in people producing food, in people producing digital services that would probably be better off collectively if we were to tackle this situation in a more responsible manner.
Now, when we talk about billions of dollars worth of trade or billions of dollars worth of tariffs, it can be hard for everyday people to really relate to those numbers. What concrete impact do these moves really have on consumers and businesses, and why is it in their best interest to have fewer barriers?
Yeah, it is true that sometimes we forget that behind these huge trade numbers, there are jobs, there are people. There is employment. There is small and medium enterprises. There are women traders. There are rich and poor nations alike participating in this movement called international trade. But let's make this a little bit more concretely. Last time the United States tried to solve issues related to steel production in the US, it was 2002. It took a similar route, a safeguard measure against the rest of the world. Ex post, we know this costed the US 200,000 jobs. That is a figure. This is the result of the measures that were taken at that time. This is why we have to be careful. Not that there is no problem. There is a problem in steel and aluminum. But the way in which we address this issue, we tackle this matter, will mean more jobs or less jobs. That's what we should be caring about.
Now, circling back to this idea of the international institutions that are put in place, in theory, to try and help deal with these sorts of disputes, there's a lot of criticism of them, particularly the World Trade Organization. What kind of a role do you see for them in the future, and what kind of reforms do they really need to undertake to become less controversial and perhaps more useful?
Well, like other international organizations, we tend to undervalue the worth of the organization and exaggerate the defects in the organization. For sure, there are things that can be improved in the work of the World Trade Organization. But let's not forget that if trade relations between nations since the Second World War have basically worked, have remained relatively open, have helped lift millions out of poverty, has helped generate growth and jobs for middle classes everywhere around the world. It's also thanks to the rules of the game that the WTO has provided. If after the 2008 crisis we didn't see a huge surge in protectionism, it's because there was a system, the system of rules and procedures, boring, bureaucratic, guarantees. It's a collective insurance policy. It's called the World Trade Organization. This is why we should care about it now and not cry over spilled milk once we've broken it.
There's also a growing backlash against these sort of mega trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even the one between the European Union and Canada. Do you think that there's still a future for those sort of sweeping free trade deals, or do they need to be done on a more targeted basis?
I think that what we have to make sure is that these trade agreements that are concluded translate into real trade on the ground and translate into trade for a large number of economic actors. There is a sentiment out there that it's only benefiting few actors, the 1% of our societies. It has to benefit 100% of our societies. It has to be for the benefit of small and medium enterprises. It has to benefit women in international trade. It has to benefit rich and poor countries alike. A lot of this does not depend on these trade agreements. It depends on social safety nets, taxation, infrastructure. So what we need to make sure is that we have robust mechanisms that help us better distribute the benefits generated by international trade agreements, but also that we have the mechanisms to also help cushion the negative effect that these trade agreements will also inevitably bring to our economies.
The other area where we're seeing a lot of questions about trade is Brexit. The UK and EU are still trying to finalise a new agreement. What do you think are the biggest challenges and perhaps the biggest pitfalls for negotiators?
Well, I think the biggest pitfall today is the absence of clarity on what kind of relationship, trade and economic relationship, the UK wants to have with the rest of the European Union once it has left the European Union. And it's a question that has not yet been answered. We know what the UK does not want, but in reality, we do not know what the UK wants. And it's important to know what the UK wants, because it has to be tested about what the other members of the European Union would be ready to negotiate with the United Kingdom. So I think there is urgency now in clarifying what type of trade and economic relationship the UK wants to have with the EU post-Brexit. That's where the big question mark requires an answer. The sooner the better, because otherwise uncertainty is not going to help with growth. It's not going to help with economic stability, and it will ultimately have impact on jobs.
Lastly, with the world's biggest economies embroiled in these sort of spats, where does that leave developing and emerging economies?
Well, it's very interesting what's happening in the rest of the world. After many years of being told that opening markets and integrating regionally and reforming at home was good, they are now convinced that this is the right way to go. Take Africa, for example. Just a few days ago, they concluded a continental free trade agreement that will create a big African free trade area spanning 55 countries. And they are doing this not because they were told that this was good for them, but because today they are convinced that this is the only way to be stronger in international trade, is to help build these trade relationships that don't exist today within the African continent. So it's interesting to see that as some countries are doubting on the value of international trade, on the value of solidarity, on the value of pooling sovereignty, some other parts of the world are going exactly in the opposite direction.
Arancha Gonzales, thank you so much for your insight today. And thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.